Sometimes a man loses everything and finds himself with nothing but the clothes on his back and a faithful dog by his side. That's exactly what happened to Hatch Greeley after fever took his wife and children, leaving him to wander the mountains of Pine Hollow like a ghost of his former self. For years, folks had whispered about the old stone mansion they called Widow's Roost. Nobody wanted it. Nobody would even go near it. But when winter was coming and Hatch needed shelter, he walked into the sheriff's office and bought it for 50 cents. The sheriff thought he was crazy. The townspeople thought he was desperate. But when Hatch opened that front door, with his hound Rufus beside him, what he found inside wasn't just an empty house. Hidden beneath the old floorboards was something that had been waiting 20 years to be discovered. Something that would change his life forever. But what could be so important that someone would hide it away and let a perfectly good house sit empty for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke through the valley as Hatch Greeley made his way down the mountain trail for the first time in 3 months. His boots, worn thin from years of walking these rocky paths, crunched softly on the carpet of orange and gold that nature had spread before him. Beside him, his faithful companion Rufus, a grizzled old blue-tick hound with more grey than blue in his coat, padded along with the patient dignity of a dog who had learned that life moved at its own pace, regardless of human urgency. Hatch paused at the overlook where the trail bent toward town, his weathered hands gripping the smooth walking stick he'd carved from mountain ash 2 winters ago. Below him, Pine Hollow stretched out like a picture from a simpler time, wooden storefronts with hand-painted signs, a white church steeple pointing toward heaven, and houses clustered together as if seeking comfort in each other's presence. Smoke drifted from chimneys in lazy spirals, and he could make out tiny figures moving about their daily business with the purposeful energy of people who belonged somewhere. Once, he had belonged somewhere too. The memory came unbidden, as they always did, Sarah humming in their kitchen while she kneaded bread, the sweet sound of children's laughter echoing from the yard where little Emma and Thomas played with their wooden toys. The cabin they'd built together with their own hands, where every beam and board held the weight of shared dreams, where love had lived in the careful way Sarah arranged wildflowers in mason jars, and in the proud way Thomas had shown him a frog he'd caught by the creek, and in the gentle way Emma had fallen, asleep against his chest during evening stories, all of it swept away in 3 terrible weeks when the fever came through the valley like a thief in the night. Hatch closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the mountain air fill his lungs and push away the darkness that always threatened to swallow him whole. When he opened them again, his gaze settled on the edge of town, where Widow's Roost perched on its lonely hill like a monument to forgotten sorrows. Even from this distance, the old stone mansion commanded attention. Built from local granite that had been quarried decades ago, its walls rose 3 stories high with Gothic windows that stared out at the world like hollow eyes. The slate roof, though weathered and missing tiles in places, still held its dignified peaks and valleys. Ivy had claimed much of the eastern wall, and wild grass grew knee-high in what had once been carefully tended gardens. But beneath the neglect, Hatch could see the bones of something magnificent. A house built to last generations, crafted by hands that understood both stone and dreams. The locals avoided it like they might avoid a graveyard at midnight. Hatch had heard the stories, whispered in the general store, and shared over drinks at Murphy's saloon. They said old Magnus Holbrook had built it for his bride back in 73, importing craftsmen from back east and sparing no expense. They said his wife, Eleanor, had loved that house more than life itself, filling it with music and laughter and the kind of entertaining that made Pine Hollow feel like civilization. Had finally arrived in the wilderness. They also said Eleanor had died in that house under circumstances no one liked to discuss, and that Magnus had vanished one winter night, leaving behind nothing but questions and an empty mansion that seemed to accumulate shadows faster than dust. "Cursed," the old-timers would mutter, shaking their heads. Ain't nothing good ever came from that place, but Hatch had lived through his own curse, and it had taught him that sometimes the things people feared most were simply broken, like he was. And broken things, he'd learned, could still serve a purpose if a man wasn't too particular about perfection. The trail wound down through stands of pine and aspen, and soon he could hear the familiar sounds of Pine Hollow, awakening to another day. Horses snorting and stamping in the livery stable, the ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith shop, the creak of wagon wheels on dusty streets. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. The kind of sounds that reminded a man that life continued even when his own world had ended. Sheriff Jim Morrison was sweeping the porch of his office when Hatch and Rufus emerged from the tree line. Morrison was a good man, fair-minded and steady, with the kind of calm authority that came from years of keeping peace in a place where people generally wanted to be left alone to live their lives. He'd been a friend to Hatch in the terrible time after the fever, checking on him when he could, making sure he had supplies for the winter, never pushing, but always letting it be known that help was available if needed. "Hatch," Morrison called out, setting his broom aside and stepping to the edge of the porch. "Good to see you, friend. Been wondering how you were faring up there." "Surviving," Hatch replied, which was about as much as he could honestly claim. "Winter's coming early this year. Can feel it in the air." Morrison nodded, understanding more than what was said. "Coffee's fresh if you want some. Martha brought by some of her apple cake this morning, too." The invitation was kind, but Hatch could see the concern in the sheriff's eyes, the careful way he studied Hatch's face, looking for signs of a man pushed too far by solitude and grief. Morrison meant well, but Hatch wasn't ready for kindness, wasn't ready to pretend that sitting in a warm office eating cake could fill the hollow places inside him. "Appreciate it," Hatch said, "but I've got business to discuss." Something in his tone made Morrison's eyebrows rise slightly. In all the months since the fever, Hatch had never spoken of business. He'd been a man suspended outside the flow of ordinary concerns, existing but not quite living. Now, though, there was a different quality to his voice. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the absence of complete hopelessness. "All right then," Morrison said, gesturing toward his office. "Come on in." The sheriff's office smelled of leather and tobacco, with undertones of the strong coffee that Morrison brewed black as midnight and nearly as thick. Maps covered one wall, showing the county boundaries and marking the scattered homesteads and claims that dotted the wilderness like islands in a vast green sea. A pot-bellied stove radiated comfortable warmth, and Rufus immediately claimed a spot beside it, settling down with a contented sigh. Morrison poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and offered some to Hatch, who declined with a shake of his head. They'd known each other long enough that small talk wasn't necessary. Morrison could read the set of Hatch's shoulders, the way he stood with his hat in his hands, the quiet determination that had replaced the lost wandering of recent months. "What's on your mind, Hatch?" Hatch reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, its contents making a soft metallic sound as he set it on Morrison's desk. "I want to buy the Holbrook place." Morrison nearly choked on his coffee. "The Holbrook place? You mean Widow's Roost?" "That's the one." The sheriff set his cup down carefully, as if sudden movements might spook this strange idea back into the wilderness where it belonged. "Hatch, that house has been sitting empty for near 20 years. County's been trying to sell it for back taxes, but nobody wants it. Folks say it's cursed." "I've heard." Hatch's voice carried no mockery, just a tired acceptance of human nature. "But curses are just stories people tell when they don't understand something. I need shelter for the winter, and that house needs someone to live in it." "Seems like we might suit each other." Morrison studied his old friend, searching for signs of madness or desperation. What he saw instead was something he hadn't seen in Hatch for months: purpose. It wasn't happiness, might never be happiness again, but it was movement forward instead of the endless circling that grief had trapped him in. "It'll need work," Morrison said slowly. Probably lots of work. Roof might leak, floors might be rotten, could be animals living in there for all we know. I've got time and strong hands, Hatch replied. What's the county asking for it? Morrison opened a drawer and rifled through papers until he found the tax records. Let's see here. Property taxes are $73.47. Been accumulating interest for years. With penalties and fees, county says they'd take $50 for it. Hatch opened the leather pouch and counted out coins, silver dollars, half dollars, and quarters that represented months of small transactions with other mountain folk. Trading game and labor for the basic necessities of survival. When he finished counting, 2 quarters remained on Morrison's desk. 50 cents, Hatch said. That's what I've got. The sheriff stared at the coins, as if they might multiply through force of will. Hatch, that's not even close to what they're asking. It's what I can pay, Hatch said simply. And it's more than anyone else has offered in 20 years. Morrison leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. He'd been sheriff long enough to understand that sometimes the law was less important than justice, and sometimes justice was less important than simple human compassion. The county commissioners would probably be happy to get anything for that white elephant of a property. And if Hatch Greeley wanted to take on the challenge of making it habitable, maybe that was exactly what both he and the house needed. I'll tell you what, Morrison said finally. Let me talk to the county boys. Explain the situation. Might be they'd consider taking payments or working out some kind of arrangement. But Hatch was already shaking his head. 50 cents, Jim, today, that's my offer. There was something final in his voice, a quiet dignity that suggested this wasn't desperation talking, but a man who had looked at his life and made a deliberate choice about how to spend what remained of it. Morrison understood that pushing for more money might mean losing the chance to see his friend rejoin the living altogether. All right, Morrison said, scooping up the quarters and dropping them into his desk drawer. I'll draw up the papers. Far as I'm concerned, Hatch Greeley just bought himself a stone mansion for 50 cents. The iron key felt cold and heavy in Hatch's palm as he stood before the massive oak door of Widow's Roost 3 days later. Sheriff Morrison had found it hanging on a nail in the county office, tagged with a faded label that simply read Holbrook Property. The key was old, its surface mottled with rust and age, but when Hatch had tested it in the lock, it turned with surprising ease, as if the house itself was eager to finally welcome someone home. Rufus whined softly beside him, his usual calm replaced by an anxious energy that made his tail twitch and his ears swivel at sounds only he could hear. The old hound had been acting strange since they'd climbed the overgrown path to the mansion's front porch, and now he pressed close against Hatch's leg, as if seeking reassurance that this venture was wise. Easy. Boy, Hatch murmured, running his fingers through the dog's grizzled fur. Just an old house. Nothing here that can hurt us worse than what we've already been through. The words were meant to comfort them both. But as Hatch pushed open the heavy door, its hinges groaning in protest after years of silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing more than just a threshold. The air that rushed out to greet them carried the scent of decades, dust and dried wood, faded perfume and old leather. The lingering ghost of lives once lived within these walls. Afternoon sunlight slanted through tall windows, illuminating a grand foyer that spoke of wealth and careful craftsmanship. The floor was laid with black and white marble tiles in a checkerboard pattern, though many were cracked and several were missing altogether. A sweeping staircase curved upward to the second floor, its mahogany banister carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines. Crystal chandeliers hung from medallion ceilings, their faceted surfaces catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the faded wallpaper. But it was the silence that struck him most forcefully, not the peaceful quiet of the mountains he'd grown accustomed to, but something deeper and more complete. This was the silence of abandonment, of a place where conversation and laughter had once filled every room, but now existed only as echoes in the walls themselves. Hatch stepped inside, his boots clicking against the marble, and Rufus followed reluctantly. his claws scraping as he tried to find purchase on the smooth stone. To their left, an archway opened into what had probably been a formal parlour, its furniture draped in dusty sheets like sleeping ghosts. To their right, another arch revealed a dining room, dominated by a massive table that could have seated 20 guests in more prosperous times. As they moved deeper into the house, Hatch found himself cataloguing the work that would need to be done. Several windows were broken, their glass lying in glittering fragments on the floors below. Water stains on the ceiling suggested roof leaks that would need immediate attention before the winter snows arrived. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, and in some places, the plaster beneath had crumbled away entirely, exposing the solid stone walls that formed the mansion's true bones. Yet beneath the neglect and decay, he could see the grandeur that had once defined this place. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Hand-carved moldings, inlaid woodwork, and stone fireplaces so large a man could stand upright inside them. Every detail spoke of care and pride, of a builder who had intended this house to stand for generations and shelter the dreams of all who dwelt within its walls. They made their way through the ground floor, exploring room after room of faded elegance. A library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, many still holding volumes whose leather bindings had cracked with age. A music room where a grand piano sat beneath a sheet, its ivory keys yellowed but still gleaming in the dusty light. A kitchen with a massive cast-iron stove and a hand pump that, when Hatch tested it, still brought up clear water from some deep well beneath the foundation. It was in the smallest room, what had probably served as a study or office, that Hatch first noticed something unusual. While every other room bore the uniform coating of dust and neglect that 20 years of abandonment would naturally accumulate, this space seemed different, cleaner somehow, as if someone had been caring for it long after the rest of the house had been left to time and weather. A simple wooden desk sat beneath the room's single window, and scattered across its surface were papers covered in careful handwriting. Hatch approached cautiously, aware that he was trespassing not just on property, but on someone's private thoughts and memories. The top sheet was a letter, begun but never finished, dated just 3 months before Magnus Holbrook's disappearance. "My dearest Eleanor," it read in a flowing script, "though you have been gone from this world for 2 years now, I find myself writing to you still, as if the words themselves might bridge the distance between this life and whatever peace you have found beyond it." Hatch's hands stilled as he read, recognizing the particular ache that lived in those carefully chosen words. Here was a man who understood the weight of loss, who had tried to carry on after the center of his world had been torn away. The letter spoke of loneliness and guilt, of responsibilities that felt meaningless without someone to share them with, of a love so deep that death itself seemed insufficient to end it. As he moved the letter aside, other documents came into view, architectural drawings showing modifications to the house, correspondence with lawyers about charitable donations, and what appeared to be a detailed map of the property with certain areas marked in red ink. But it was the final item that made Hatch's breath catch in his throat. A photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing beside a man whose features bore a striking resemblance to Hatch's own weathered face. Eleanor Holbrook had been beautiful in the way that spoke of inner light rather than mere physical perfection, and in her expression, Hatch could see something he recognized, the same joy that Sarah had carried, the same warmth that had made their simple cabin feel like the center of the universe. And Magnus, despite his fine clothes and obvious prosperity, wore the same expression of quiet devotion that Hatch had seen in his own mirror during the precious years when love had made him feel like the luckiest man alive. Beneath the photograph was a single sheet of paper covered in Magnus's handwriting. But these words were different from the unfinished letter, urgent and desperate. As if written in great haste, "They don't understand what we've found beneath the foundation." Eleanor saw it first, said it was a gift from God himself, but the others see only opportunity for their own gain. I've hidden what matters most, where only someone who truly understands love and loss might find it. The key to everything lies where sorrow and hope meet in equal measure. Trust no one who seeks only profit. The real treasure belongs to those who have lost everything and still believe in tomorrow. A loose floorboard creaked ominously beneath Hatch's feet as he leaned forward to study the cryptic message more closely. The sound was sharp in the dusty silence, and when he looked down, he noticed that several of the wide pine planks seemed to sit unevenly, as if they had been removed and replaced at some point. Kneeling beside Rufus, who had finally relaxed enough to lie down in a patch of sunlight, Hatch pressed his palm against the questionable boards. They shifted slightly under pressure, and when he worked his fingers into the gap between two planks, he found that one lifted easily, too easily for wood that should have been nailed down securely for decades. Beneath the loose board was a space that had been deliberately hollowed out, and nestled within that hiding place was an object wrapped in oiled cloth. Hatch lifted it carefully, his heart hammering with the kind of anticipation he hadn't felt since childhood Christmas mornings. As he unwrapped the cloth, a brass compass was revealed, not the simple navigation tool a man might carry in his pack, but an ornate instrument with engravings around its rim and a face marked with symbols he didn't immediately recognize. The needle spun wildly for a moment before settling on a direction that definitely wasn't magnetic north, but it was what he found beneath the compass that truly took his breath away. A leather journal bound with a cord, its pages filled with careful diagrams, detailed maps, and entries written in the same hand that had penned the desperate note on the desk. The first page bore a simple inscription: "For whoever finds this record, may you have the wisdom to use what we discovered for healing rather than harm." As Hatch opened the journal and began to read, one thing became abundantly clear. Magnus and Eleanor Holbrook had discovered something beneath their stone mansion that was far more valuable than gold, something that could change the fortunes of Pine Hollow forever. And someone, perhaps the entire town, had been willing to let them disappear rather than allow that secret to see the light of day. Hatch spent the remainder of that first day reading Magnus Holbrook's journal by the fading light of the study window. Rufus curled at his feet like a faithful guardian. The entries painted a picture of a man transformed by love and then broken by loss, but more than that, they revealed a story that seemed to echo across the decades directly into Hatch's own wounded heart. Magnus had come to Pine Hollow in 1871, a young man with inherited wealth and grand ambitions. He'd purchased the land where Widow's Roost now stood because of its commanding view of the valley, but also because of something the previous owner had mentioned in passing, stories told by the local Crow tribe about a sacred spring that was said to heal both body and spirit. Most folks dismiss such tales as superstition, but Magnus had been curious enough to explore. What he'd found, according to his careful documentation, was far more remarkable than he'd dared to hope. Deep beneath the granite outcropping where he would eventually build his mansion, a natural cavern housed a spring whose waters exhibited properties that defied conventional explanation. Samples he'd sent to colleagues back east had been analyzed and reanalyzed, but the scientists could only confirm what Magnus had observed. The water seemed to possess genuine healing qualities that went beyond mere mineral content. Eleanor had been the first to truly understand the significance of their discovery. A woman of both intelligence and compassion, she'd immediately grasped that they'd been entrusted with something that could benefit not just Pine Hollow, but anyone who suffered from ailments that conventional medicine couldn't touch. She'd begun quietly helping townspeople with various conditions, never claiming credit, never seeking payment, simply offering the water to those in need and watching as remarkable recoveries followed. But word had spread, as word always does in small communities, and soon Pine Hollow found itself dealing with an influx of strangers, sick people seeking miraculous cures, speculators looking to exploit a natural resource, and worst of all, men with enough money and influence to take. what they wanted regardless of who might be harmed in the process. The journal's tone grew darker as Magnus described the pressure that began mounting on them to reveal the exact location of the spring and to enter into partnerships that would have commercialized their discovery. Eleanor had been adamant that such a gift from nature should never become a source of profit. But their refusal to cooperate had made them enemies among people who were accustomed to getting their way. Hatch turned the pages carefully, noting how Magnus's handwriting became more hurried and agitated as the entries progressed toward Eleanor's death. She had fallen ill quite suddenly, struck down by the same fever that had swept through the valley 2 decades later to claim Hatch's own family. Magnus had tried desperately to save her with the very waters that had healed so many others. But sometimes even miracles had their limits. The water could not touch what was killing her, Magnus had written in an entry dated just days before Eleanor's death. I begin to wonder if there are forces at work here beyond our understanding, if our refusal to share what we've found has somehow brought a curse upon our house. Eleanor speaks of seeing shadowy figures in the garden at night, men who disappear when I go to investigate. I fear we are no longer safe in our own home. The final entries in the journal were brief and hurried, written in the weeks following Eleanor's funeral. Magnus described his growing certainty that he was being watched, that his mail was being intercepted, and that certain influential men in Pine Hollow were planning to take by force what they couldn't obtain through negotiation. His last entry was dated the very day he disappeared. I have hidden the true map, where only someone who understands love and loss might think to look for it. The compass will guide the worthy to what matters most, but the greedy will find only empty chambers. Let this record serve as warning. The spring's power comes with responsibility. Those who would exploit it for gain will discover that some gifts from the earth itself demand a price that no amount of gold can pay. As darkness fell over the mansion, Hatch carefully closed the journal and examined the brass compass more closely. Its engravings were intricate and beautiful, depicting scenes of natural healing. A wounded deer drinking from a stream, a withered tree restored to full leaf, a man kneeling beside flowing water with his hands raised in gratitude. The needle continued to point in a direction that had nothing to do with magnetic north, instead indicating something toward the rear of the house. Following the compass's guidance, Hatch lit an oil lamp he'd found in the kitchen and made his way through rooms draped in shadows and memories. Rufus padded along beside him, no longer anxious but alert, as if he too sensed they were close to something significant. The compass led them past the grand staircase, through a butler's pantry, and finally to a heavy wooden door that opened onto a stone stairway descending into the mansion's foundation. The air grew cooler as they descended, and Hatch could hear the distant sound of running water echoing off stone walls. The stairway ended in a natural cavern that had been partially modified with stonework, creating a series of chambers that followed the underground stream Magnus had written about. But as they explored deeper, it became clear that someone had been here recently, much more recently than 20 years ago. Fresh boot prints marked the sandy floor near the water's edge, and several of the stone chambers showed signs of recent excavation. Tools had been left scattered about, and in one area someone had built a crude dam to divert part of the stream into wooden channels that led away into the darkness. Most telling of all, the main chamber where the spring emerged from deep within the earth had been stripped of the natural crystal formations that Magnus had described in such detail. "Well, boy," Hatch said quietly, scratching behind Rufus's ears as they stood surveying the evidence of theft and desecration. "It looks like we're not the only ones interested in what old Magnus left behind." The compass in his hand began to vibrate gently, its needle spinning wildly before settling on a new direction, not toward the damaged spring, but toward a narrow passage that led deeper into the hillside. Something else was down here, something the recent visitors either hadn't found or hadn't been able to reach. As Hatch held the lamp higher, he could see that the passage had been deliberately concealed behind a carefully constructed wall of loose stones. one that would appear natural to casual observation, but could be dismantled by someone who knew what to look for. Magnus Holbrook, it seemed, had been even more clever than his enemies had given him credit for. The healing spring they'd discovered and partially destroyed was just the beginning of the mystery. The real treasure, whatever that might be, lay hidden deeper in the mountain, protected by more than just stone and darkness. But as Hatch began to carefully remove the concealing stones, a new sound reached his ears from somewhere above. The creak of floorboards, the soft whisper of careful footsteps moving through the mansion's rooms. Someone else was in Widow's Roost, and whoever it was had arrived without making enough noise to alert Rufus, which meant they were either very skilled at moving silently or very familiar with the old house's layout. Hatch extinguished his lamp immediately, plunging them into complete darkness, and listened as the footsteps moved methodically from room to room directly above their heads, as if searching for something specific. After several long minutes, the sounds faded toward the front of the house, followed by the distant creak of the front door, closing. When he was certain they were alone again, Hatch relit the lamp and considered his options. Someone knew he was here, knew he'd found Magnus's hiding place, and was clearly willing to trespass on private property to pursue their own agenda. The question was whether they were simply curious about the new owner of Widow's Roost, or if they represented the same forces that had driven Magnus Holbrook to desperate measures 20 years ago. The next morning brought Martha Henley to Hatch's door, carrying a basket and wearing the determined expression of a woman on a mission of mercy. Martha was Pine Hollow's unofficial caretaker of souls, a widow who'd lost her husband to a mining accident and had since devoted herself to ensuring that no one in town went without a hot meal when they needed it most. Hatch. "Greeley," she said as he opened the door, "you look like a man who hasn't had a proper breakfast in far too long." Before he could protest, she'd bustled past him into the mansion's grand foyer, her boots clicking on the marble as she looked around with frank assessment. Rufus emerged from the kitchen, tail wagging at the prospect of someone who might have food. "My goodness," Martha breathed, setting her basket down. "I haven't been inside this place since Eleanor Holbrook's funeral reception." "She had such elegant taste." "You knew her?" Hatch asked, surprised by the connection. "Oh yes, Eleanor and I were dear friends. She was 10 years older than me, but she had such a generous spirit, always helping folks." Martha's eyes grew distant with memory. "When my mother was dying of the consumption, Eleanor would come by with these special teas she'd brew. Said they were made with herbs from her garden, but they helped more than anything the doctor could do." Hatch thought of the journal entries describing Eleanor's quiet healing work and felt a chill of recognition. "Did she ever mention anything unusual about this place? About the property itself?" Martha studied his face with the shrewd eyes of a woman who'd raised 6 children and buried a husband. "Why do you ask? You finding things that make you curious about the folks who lived here before?" There was something in her tone that suggested she knew more than she was letting on, and Hatch decided that if he was going to uncover the truth about what had happened to the Holbrooks, he needed allies who understood the history of Pine Hollow better than he did. "I've been reading some papers Magnus left behind," he said carefully. "Seems like he and Eleanor discovered something on this property that attracted the wrong kind of attention." Martha nodded slowly, unsurprised by his revelation. "Eleanor tried to keep it quiet, but word gets around in a small town. Folks started noticing that people who went to her for help with their ailments seemed to get better faster than they should have. Much faster." She moved to one of the tall windows and gazed out at the overgrown gardens. There were men from back east who came sniffing around toward the end, asking questions about the Holbrooks, offering to buy land they had no business wanting. Magnus got nervous, started talking about moving away somewhere safer. What happened the night he disappeared? "That's the question, isn't it?" Martha turned back to him. Official story was that he just up and left. Couldn't bear to stay in the house where Eleanor died. But Magnus loved this place almost as much as he loved his wife. He wouldn't have abandoned it without good reason. She picked up her basket and headed toward the kitchen. Hatch followed, noting how confidently she navigated the mansion's layout, despite not having been inside for 20 years. There were other stories, she continued as she began unpacking ham, fresh eggs and bread. Stories about lights seen in the mansion weeks after Magnus disappeared, sounds of digging coming from the property late at night. Sheriff back then was Sam Morrison, Jim's father, and he investigated some, but never found evidence of anything concrete. While Martha worked at the massive stove, coaxing flame from its cold firebox, Hatch found himself studying her movements. There was something almost ritualistic about the way she prepared the meal, as if she was performing a ceremony of comfort and nourishment. "Martha," he said quietly, "do you think Magnus found something on this property that certain people wanted badly enough to kill for?" She paused in her stirring of the eggs, her wooden spoon still for a long moment. "I think Magnus and Eleanor found something that could have changed a lot of lives for the better. And I think there were men who saw dollar signs instead of human suffering. What do you think happened to people who stood between those men and what they wanted?" The implication hung in the air like smoke, and Hatch felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. The same feeling he'd had during his years as a young man working the silver mines, when he'd learned that some people would do anything for money and power. Regardless of who got hurt in the process, they ate breakfast in the mansion's small morning room, where tall windows let in golden autumn light. Martha proved to be a remarkable cook, and even Rufus benefited from her generosity, receiving scraps of ham and gentle attention. "I've been thinking," Martha said as she poured coffee, "about what you might need to make this place livable for winter. It's a big house for one man, but there are rooms that could be made comfortable without too much work. I appreciate the thought, but I can manage." "I'm sure you can," she said with the patient tone of someone who dealt with stubborn men before. "But there's something else you should know. Yesterday evening I saw Cyrus Blackwood's carriage heading up this way. Cyrus owns most of the mining operations east of town, and he's not the sort of man who pays social calls on hermits." Hatch set down his coffee cup, remembering the footsteps he'd heard moving through the house the night before. "What time was this?" "Just after dark. I was walking home from Mrs. Patterson's. She's been poorly lately, and I saw his carriage turning onto the road that leads up here. Distinctive thing, that carriage. Black lacquer with silver trim, and he always travels with 2 men riding alongside. He's been to this property before." "Oh yes. Cyrus was one of the men who kept pressuring Magnus to sell, or at least to enter into some kind of partnership arrangement. Never could understand why a mining man would be interested in property with no obvious mineral deposits." She gave Hatch a meaningful look. Unless he knew something about what was really here. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp bark from Rufus, who had positioned himself by the front window. Through the glass they could see a rider approaching, a young man on a bay horse, moving at an easy pace. "That's Tommy Morrison," Martha said. "Jim's eldest boy. Wonder what brings him up here." They met Tommy on the front porch, where he dismounted and tipped his hat politely to Martha before addressing Hatch with the serious demeanor of someone carrying an official message. "Mr. Greeley, my father sent me to tell you that Cyrus Blackwood stopped by the sheriff's office this morning. He's claiming you're trespassing on property that doesn't legally belong to you, says the sale wasn't properly authorized by the county commissioners." Hatch felt his jaw tighten. "Your father witnessed the transaction." "I paid what the county was asking." "Yes, sir, and father told Mr. Blackwood exactly that. But Blackwood's got lawyers from Denver coming on the afternoon stage, and he's talking about getting an injunction to remove you from the property while the matter gets sorted out in court." Martha made a sound of disgust. "Cyrus Blackwood wouldn't know honest dealing if it bit him on his considerable backside. That man's been trying to get his hands on this land for 20 years. Tommy nodded agreement, but maintained his professional demeanor. "Father wanted you to know what was coming. Maybe give you time to gather up any papers or documents that might support your claim to the property." Hatch thought of Magnus's journal and the brass compass hidden in his coat pocket. of the violated chambers beneath the mansion and the evidence of recent excavation. Whatever Cyrus Blackwood was after, it was the same thing that had driven Magnus Holbrook to desperate measures 2 decades ago. "Tell your father I appreciate the warning," Hatch said, "and tell him I've got no intention of leaving my property without a fight." That afternoon, while storm clouds gathered over the mountains like dark promises of winter's approach, Hatch returned to the hidden chambers beneath Widow's Roost with a clearer sense of purpose. The brass compass had led him to one concealed passage, but Magnus's journal suggested there were other secrets yet to be discovered. If Cyrus Blackwood was bringing lawyers to challenge his ownership of the property, Hatch needed to understand exactly what he was fighting to protect. The concealed wall of loose stones came apart more easily than he'd expected, revealing a narrow tunnel that angled deeper into the hillside. The air that flowed from within carried the scent of deep earth and something else, a metallic tang that reminded him of the silver mines where he'd worked as a young man. Rufus whined softly as they entered the passage, his ears flat against his head, but he followed faithfully as Hatch's lamp illuminated walls carved from living rock. The tunnel opened into a chamber that took Hatch's breath away. Unlike the violated spring room they'd discovered the night before, this space remained exactly as Magnus had left it. Natural crystal formations covered the walls like frozen waterfalls, and in their depths, veins of silver gleamed in the lamplight. But it wasn't the mineral wealth that captured Hatch's attention. It was the careful way Magnus had documented everything he'd found. Wooden tables lined the chamber walls, covered with samples of rock and crystal, each labeled in Magnus's precise handwriting. Maps covered one wall, showing the underground water system that fed the healing spring, and connecting it to similar formations throughout the mountain range. But most remarkable of all was a series of photographs that Magnus had somehow managed to take in this underground space, showing the crystal formations in their original glory before the recent damage above. A leather satchel sat on the central table, and inside, Hatch found a collection of letters that painted a clearer picture of the forces that had driven Magnus into hiding. The correspondence was with scientists from universities back east, mining engineers from Colorado, and even government officials from Washington. All of them were interested in what Magnus had discovered, but for very different reasons. The scientists wanted to study the healing properties of the spring water and understand how the unique mineral formations might be creating its beneficial effects. The mining engineers saw dollar signs in the silver deposits. The government officials wrote cryptically about strategic mineral reserves and national interests that suggested military applications Hatch couldn't quite grasp, but it was the final letter in the collection that made Hatch's blood run cold. Written on expensive letterhead from a Denver law firm, it was addressed to Magnus just 2 weeks before his disappearance. "Mr. Holbrook, our client has grown impatient with your continued refusal to enter into reasonable negotiations regarding the mineral rights to your property. We are authorized to inform you that alternative arrangements are being considered. For the safety of yourself and your late wife's memory, we strongly encourage you to reconsider our generous offer before more direct measures become necessary." The letter was signed by the same law firm that Tommy Morrison had mentioned the lawyers Cyrus Blackwood was bringing to Pine Hollow to challenge Hatch's ownership. A sound from the tunnel behind him made Hatch spin around, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he carried on his belt. But instead of an intruder, he found Martha Henley emerging from the passage, her practical skirts hiked up to avoid the rough stone floor, and a determined expression on her weathered face. "Thought I might find you down here," she said, accepting the hand he offered to help her navigate the last few steps into the chamber. "Tommy Morrison stopped by my place after he left here, and we got to talking about things that have been bothering me for 20 years. Martha, this could be dangerous. If Blackwood's people find out you're involved, Cyrus Blackwood doesn't scare me," she interrupted, though Hatch noticed the way her eyes swept the chamber. taking in the evidence of Magnus's research with the sharp attention of someone who understood its significance. I've been dealing with men like him my whole life. What scares me is the thought that Eleanor died protecting something important. And now another good person might suffer, because greedy men can't leave well enough alone. She moved to the wall of maps, studying the careful documentation of the underground water system. Eleanor told me once that she believed this place was meant to be a gift to anyone who needed healing, not a source of profit for those who already had more than they needed. She said the water worked best for people who approached it with gratitude rather than greed. You think that's more than just superstition? Martha turned to face him, and in the lamplight her expression was grave. I think Eleanor was a wise woman who understood things most of us never think about. I also think there are men in this world who would destroy something beautiful and healing if it meant they could make money from the pieces. She pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket and handed it to him. This might help you understand what you're really up against. The document was a survey map of Pine Hollow and the surrounding area, dated just 3 months ago. Red lines marked proposed mining claims that would cover not just Widow's Roost, but half the valley, including the town itself. Stamped across the bottom was the seal of Blackwood Mining Enterprises and a notation that read, "Preliminary environmental assessment approved for large-scale extraction operations." Where did you get this? My nephew works as a clerk in the county office in Denver. He's been keeping an eye on things since I asked him to watch for any unusual activity involving Pine Hollow. This came through last week, along with applications for something called eminent domain proceedings and permits for hydraulic mining equipment. Hatch studied the map with growing alarm. Hydraulic mining was the most destructive form of mineral extraction he'd ever seen, using high-pressure water cannons to blast away entire hillsides in search of ore. If Blackwood was planning that kind of operation, he wasn't just interested in the silver deposits beneath Widow's Roost. He was planning to tear apart the entire valley. The healing spring, Hatch said, understanding flooding through him. If they use hydraulic mining, they'll destroy the whole underground water system. Everything Magnus and Eleanor tried to protect will be gone. Worse than that, Martha replied grimly. Look at where those red lines end. Hatch traced the proposed mining claims and felt his stomach drop. The lines extended right through the center of Pine Hollow itself, encompassing the church, the school, the general store, and most of the residential area. They're planning to relocate the entire town, or eliminate it altogether. Cheaper to move people out than to work around them. The implications were staggering. Blackwood wasn't just after the healing spring or the silver deposits. He was planning to obliterate everything that had made Pine Hollow a community worth preserving. The generations of families who had built lives in this valley, the careful balance between human settlement and natural beauty, the simple dignity of people who had chosen to make their homes far from the corrupting influence of big cities and bigger money. We have to stop him, Hatch said. But even as the words left his mouth, he wondered how 2 people and an old dog could stand against the kind of wealth and legal power that Blackwood commanded. We will, Martha replied with the quiet certainty of someone who had faced impossible odds before and found ways to prevail. But first, we need to make sure we understand exactly what Magnus left behind for us to find. That compass of yours? It led you here, but I'm betting it's got more secrets to reveal. As if responding to her words, the brass compass in Hatch's pocket began to vibrate gently, its needle spinning before settling on a direction that led deeper into the mountain. Whatever Magnus Holbrook had hidden in these chambers, they hadn't found it all yet. And with Blackwood's lawyers arriving tomorrow, time was running short to uncover the truth that might save not just Widow's Roost, but the entire valley that had become home to so many. Families seeking peace and simple happiness in a complicated world. Following the compass's guidance deeper into the mountain led them through a series of narrow passages that opened into chambers Magnus had clearly used for different purposes. One contained careful geological specimens arranged on wooden shelves, each labeled with dates and locations throughout the mountain range. Another held what appeared to be a primitive laboratory where Magnus had conducted experiments on the spring water, testing its effects on various plants and animals with the methodical approach of a trained scientist. But it was the final chamber that revealed the true scope of Magnus's discovery. Unlike the others, this space had been carefully sealed behind a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. The brass compass vibrated more strongly as they approached, and when Hatch inserted the rusted iron key he'd found in the mansion's study, the lock turned with a satisfying click that echoed through the underground passages. The chamber beyond was larger than all the others combined, its walls lined with more of the remarkable crystal formations that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. But at the center of the space, Magnus had constructed something that took Hatch's breath away, a scale model of the entire Pine Hollow Valley, carved from wood and stone with incredible attention to detail. Every building in town was represented, from the church steeple to the smallest homestead cabin. The terrain matched the actual geography perfectly, complete with the winding creek that fed the valley's farms and the network of springs that emerged from the mountainside throughout the region. But most remarkable of all were the thin silver wires that connected various points on the model, creating a complex web that seemed to map the underground water system in 3 dimensions. "My lord," Martha whispered, moving closer to study the intricate construction. He mapped the entire aquifer system. "Look at how all these springs connect underground." Hatch followed the silver wires with his eyes, beginning to understand the true scope of what Magnus and Eleanor had discovered. The healing spring beneath Widow's Roost wasn't an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a vast network of interconnected water sources that fed the entire valley. The unique mineral formations that gave the water its healing properties extended throughout the mountain range, creating a natural system that had been providing clean, beneficial water to the region for thousands of years. A thick journal lay open beside the model, and its pages revealed Magnus's growing understanding of what they'd found. The healing properties weren't limited to the main spring. They were present throughout the water system, though in varying concentrations. Wells and springs throughout Pine Hollow had been providing subtle health benefits to the residents for decades, without anyone realizing the source of their unusually good health and longevity. "Look at this," Martha said, pointing to a section of the model where red paint marked several locations. "He's identified the key points where the water system is most vulnerable. If someone damaged these specific areas, the whole system would collapse." Hatch finished, understanding the implications. Blackwood's hydraulic mining operation wouldn't just destroy the main spring. It would poison the water supply for the entire valley. Magnus's final journal entries, written in the days before his disappearance, revealed his growing desperation as he realized the scope of the threat. The men pressuring him to sell weren't just interested in quick profit from the silver deposits. They understood that controlling the water system would give them power over the entire region. Towns, farms, and ranches throughout the area would be forced to pay for water or relocate entirely. But Magnus had been more clever than his enemies realized. Hidden within the model were detailed plans for protecting the water system, including engineering drawings for structures that could be built to redirect and safeguard the underground flows if the main sources were threatened. More importantly, he documented legal evidence of prior water rights that predated any mining claims, rights that belonged to the Crow tribe who had first recognized the sacred nature of these springs. "He was going to give it back," Martha said softly, reading over Hatch's shoulder as he studied the legal documents Magnus had prepared. The land, the water rights, everything. He was going to deed it all to the Crow Nation to keep it safe from men like Blackwood. A leather portfolio contained the actual documents, prepared by lawyers in Denver, but never filed due to Magnus's sudden disappearance. The papers would have established the springs as protected tribal lands, making them immune to mining claims or commercial development. But without Magnus to complete the transaction, the documents had remained hidden in this underground chamber for 20 years. "We could still do it," Hatch said, studying the carefully prepared legal papers. If these documents are properly executed, Blackwood's claims would be invalidated. The federal government recognizes tribal water rights as superior to mining claims. Martha nodded, but her expression remained troubled. The question is whether we can get them filed before Blackwood's lawyers arrive with their injunction, and whether the current tribal leadership would still be willing to accept the responsibility. As if summoned by their conversation, footsteps echoed from the tunnel leading back to the main chamber. Both Hatch and Martha froze, listening as someone, or several someones, moved through the underground passages with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. "Stay here," Hatch whispered, extinguishing his lamp and moving toward the door. "If something happens to me, take those documents and get them to Sheriff Morrison." But Martha shook her head firmly. "We face this together, whatever it is." The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the glow of torchlight, reflecting off the crystal formations in the passages beyond. When the light finally reached their chamber, it revealed not Blackwood's hired men, but three figures Hatch didn't recognize, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in practical outdoor clothing and moving with the quiet dignity of people accustomed to walking carefully through sacred spaces. The woman stepped forward, and in the torchlight, Hatch could see the strong features and graying hair of someone who carried authority naturally. When she spoke, her voice was calm and measured, with the slight accent of someone whose first language wasn't English. "I am Mary Crowfeather," she said, inclining her head respectfully toward both Hatch and Martha. "My grandfather was Chief Standing Bear, who signed the original water agreements with Magnus Holbrook 30 years ago. We have been waiting a long time for someone to find this place and understand what it means." Hatch felt the brass compass grow warm in his pocket, and he realized that Magnus's plan had been even more sophisticated than he'd imagined. The compass hadn't just been guiding him to hidden chambers and forgotten documents. It had been leading him toward the people who could complete the work. Magnus and Eleanor had started. "You knew we were here," Martha said. "And it wasn't quite a question." Mary Crowfeather smiled, and in her expression was the patience of someone whose people had learned to think in generations rather than years. "The mountain speaks to those who know how to listen." When strangers began digging in the sacred places and disturbing the water spirits, the signs pointed toward changes coming. When a man with a grieving heart took ownership of the stone house, the signs suggested that healing might finally be possible. She gestured toward the model Magnus had constructed, and Hatch noticed that her hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with tools and understood the value of craftsmanship. "My grandfather helped Magnus map these water sources. Our people have been guardians of this system for more generations than the white settlements have existed. We are ready to accept that responsibility again, if you are ready to trust us with it." The moment felt weighted with significance that went far beyond legal documents and mining claims. This was about stewardship and sacred trust, about protecting something precious for future generations rather than exploiting it for immediate gain. It was about choosing community over profit, healing over destruction, wisdom over greed. "What do we need to do?" Hatch asked. Mary Crowfeather moved to the scale model with the reverence of someone approaching a sacred object, her weathered fingers tracing the silver wires that mapped the underground water system. "First, you must understand that what Magnus discovered was not new to our people. We have known of the healing waters for centuries, long before the first white settlements came to this valley." She indicated one of her companions, a younger man whose patient expression suggested he was accustomed to listening more than speaking. "This is my nephew, Joseph Standing Bear. He is a lawyer trained in Denver who has been working to reclaim our ancestral water rights throughout this region. The documents Magnus prepared were based on legal research Joseph provided 20 years ago. The revelation struck Hatch like a physical blow. "You were working with Magnus before he disappeared." "Not working with," Mary clarified gently. "Magnus came to us after Eleanor's death, seeking guidance about how to protect what they had found. My grandfather, who was still alive then, told him that the healing waters were never meant to be owned by any individual, white or Indian. They were meant to be protected and shared with all who approached them in the right spirit. Joseph Standing Bear stepped forward, pulling a leather satchel from his coat. Magnus asked me to prepare legal documents that would ensure the springs could never be commercially exploited. But on the night we were supposed to complete the transaction, he sent word that it wasn't safe to proceed. Men were watching his house, and he feared for our safety as well as his own. That was the last anyone heard from him, Mary added, until 3 days ago, when the mountain spirits began whispering that someone with a good heart had finally found the key to Magnus's hiding place. The third member of their group, an elderly man who had remained silent until now, moved closer to examine the brass compass that Hatch had pulled from his pocket. The old man's eyes widened as he studied the engravings, and he spoke rapidly in what Hatch assumed was the Crow language. "My father says this compass was made by his grandfather," Mary translated. "It was given to Magnus as a sign of trust when they first began working together. The engravings tell the story of how the healing waters came to be, and the needle doesn't point to magnetic north. It points toward whatever part of the water system most needs protection." Hatch felt the world shift around him as the implications sank in. Magnus didn't just disappear. He was murdered to prevent him from transferring the land to your people. Mary's expression grew grim. "We suspected as much, but we could never prove it. The men who wanted to exploit the springs were powerful and well-connected. They made sure the investigation into Magnus's disappearance was brief and inconclusive." Martha, who had been studying the legal documents Joseph had produced, looked up with growing excitement. "These papers, they're still valid. The transfer was prepared but never executed. If we can get them filed before Blackwood's lawyers arrive with their injunction, his mining claims would be worthless." "It's not that simple," Joseph replied, though his tone suggested he shared her hope. "We need Magnus's signature to complete the transfer, and obviously that's impossible. However, there might be another way." He spread additional documents across the table beside Magnus's model. "I've been researching the original homestead laws that Magnus used to claim this property. There's a provision that allows for transfer of abandoned homesteads to caretakers who demonstrate good stewardship. If someone has been actively maintaining and improving the property, like Hatch has, by purchasing it and beginning restoration work." Martha interrupted, understanding immediately. "Exactly. And if that caretaker voluntarily transfers the property to its rightful stewards." Joseph smiled for the first time since they'd met. "The law recognizes such transfers as completing the original owner's intent, particularly when there's documented evidence of that intent." Mary's father spoke again, and this time his tone was urgent. Mary listened carefully before turning to the others with alarm in her eyes. "He says the compass is pointing toward the upper spring chambers, and that usually means immediate danger to the water system. They left the chamber quickly, following the compass's guidance, through passages that seemed to grow narrower and more treacherous as they climbed toward the surface. The sound of running water grew louder, but underneath it was another sound that made Hatch's blood run. Cold, the rhythmic pounding of machinery. The passage ended at a concealed opening that emerged behind a cluster of boulders on the hillside above Widow's Roost. Through gaps in the rocks, they could see the source of the mechanical noise that had alarmed Mary's father. A team of men with mining equipment had arrived under cover of darkness and were already beginning excavation work at the main spring site. "Blackwood's not waiting for the lawyers," Hatch said grimly. "He's planning to destroy the evidence before anyone can stop him legally." The mining operation was more extensive than any of them had imagined. Steam-powered drilling equipment had been hauled up the mountain under cover of darkness, and crews were working by torchlight to bore deep holes into the rock formations that fed the healing springs. If they succeeded in their plan, the entire underground water system would be compromised within hours. But it was what Hatch saw next that made his heart stop entirely. tied to a tree near the mining equipment, watching the destruction with the resigned expression of a man who had fought this battle before and lost, was Magnus Holbrook himself, 20 years older and bearing the marks of hard living. But unmistakably alive, Magnus sat with his hands bound and his weathered face reflecting the torchlight. He was thin and grey-haired, but his eyes still held the intelligence and determination that had driven him to hide his discoveries so carefully. "Dear God," Martha whispered. "They've been keeping him prisoner all this time?" Mary Crow Feather's expression had gone from alarm to fury. They wanted him alive in case they needed his knowledge to find what they were looking for. But now that they've decided to destroy everything, she didn't need to finish the thought. If Blackwood's men were willing to obliterate the springs rather than risk losing control of them, they certainly wouldn't leave Magnus alive to testify about 20 years of imprisonment and coercion. Joseph was already moving, pulling papers from his satchel and pressing them into Hatch's hands. "Take these documents and get back to town as fast as you can. Find Sheriff Morrison and get him to file them immediately before sunrise if possible. If Magnus is still alive, we can complete the legal transfer with his signature. What about the mining operation? They'll destroy the springs before we can stop them legally." Mary's father spoke again, and this time his words carried the weight of absolute determination. Mary translated with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "He says our people have been protecting these waters for 1,000 years. The mining equipment and a few hired men are not going to stop us now. We can't fight armed men with, we're not going to fight them," Mary interrupted. "We're going to convince them that staying here is more dangerous than leaving. My people know these mountains better than anyone, and we know exactly how to make sure Blackwood's men understand they're not welcome." As if summoned by her words, shapes began moving in the darkness beyond the mining site. Shadows that flitted between trees and rocks with the silent grace of people who had learned to move through wilderness without disturbing so much as a twig. The Crow had not come alone, and they had not come unprepared. "Go," Mary said urgently to Hatch and Martha. "Get those papers filed and bring back the sheriff. We'll make sure Magnus stays safe and the springs survive until you return." Hatch looked at the legal documents in his hands, then at the mining operation that threatened to destroy everything Magnus and Eleanor had died trying to protect. The brass compass in his pocket had grown warm enough to feel through the fabric, and its needle was spinning wildly as if responding to the presence of multiple threats requiring protection. 20 years of secrets were about to be revealed, and the battle for Pine Hollow's future was finally beginning in earnest. But for the first time since he'd discovered Magnus's journal, Hatch felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. They had allies now, and they had the legal tools to fight back. Most importantly, they had the truth on their side. The question was whether truth would be enough to overcome 20 years of lies, greed, and carefully maintained power. The ride back to Pine Hollow through the darkness tested every skill Hatch had learned during his years in the mountains. With Martha riding behind him on the horse they'd borrowed from the Crow camp, they followed deer trails and logging roads that avoided the main routes where Blackwood's men might be watching. The legal documents were secured in Hatch's coat, protected from the light rain that had begun falling as storm clouds gathered overhead. Rufus ran alongside them with the tireless energy of a dog who understood the urgency of their mission, his ears constantly swiveling to detect any sounds of pursuit. The brass compass in Hatch's pocket had settled into a steady vibration that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, as if the ancient artifact itself understood that everything Magnus and Eleanor had fought to protect now hung in the balance. They reached the outskirts of Pine Hollow just as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern mountains. The town was still sleeping, but smoke rising from the sheriff's office chimney suggested that Jim Morrison was already awake and starting his day. As they approached the building, Hatch could see light in the windows and hear the familiar sounds of coffee being prepared. Morrison met them at the door before they could knock. his expression grim and his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Figured you'd be coming," he said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Been hearing machinery up on the mountain all night, and 3 strangers rode into town about an hour ago, asking questions about who might have legal papers related to the old Holbrook property." "Blackwood's lawyers?" Martha asked, settling into one of the chairs near Morrison's desk while Hatch spread the tribal documents across the wooden surface. "One lawyer, 2 men who didn't introduce themselves but carry themselves like hired guns," Morrison replied, pouring coffee for all 3 of them with hands that remained steady despite the circumstances. "They're over at Murphy's saloon, waiting for the county clerk's office to open so they can file their injunction." Hatch explained quickly what they'd discovered in the underground chambers, the evidence of Magnus being held prisoner and the mining operation that was already destroying the spring system. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but never questioning the truth of what he was hearing. "These documents," Morrison said, studying the legal papers Joseph Standingbear had prepared, "they look legitimate to me, but I'm not a lawyer. The question is whether I can file them with the county clerk, or if they need to go through the federal courts because of the tribal involvement." Joseph said county filing would be sufficient to establish the claim, Martha replied. "The federal recognition comes later, but once these are on record, Blackwood's mining rights become null and void." Morrison was already reaching for his coat and hat. "Then we'd better get to the clerk's office before Blackwood's people do. Tom Henderson opens his office at 7 sharp, and it's 6:15 now." As they prepared to leave, the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed made them all freeze. Through the window, they could see 5 riders coming down the main street at a pace that suggested urgent business. 3 of them Hatch recognized from their brief glimpse at Murphy's saloon, the lawyer and his 2 dangerous-looking companions. The other 2 were strangers, but their expensive clothes and confident bearing suggested they were men, accustomed to getting their way through wealth and influence. "Back door," Morrison said quietly. But before they could move, one of the riders dismounted and strode to the sheriff's office entrance. The knock that followed was sharp and authoritative, the knock of someone who expected immediate attention. Morrison opened the door to reveal a well-dressed man in his 50s. With the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors and the soft build of someone who had never done physical labor. His eyes were sharp and calculating, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of wealth and legal training. "Sheriff Morrison, I am Randolph Blackwood, attorney for Blackwood Mining Enterprises. I believe you have in your possession certain individuals who have unlawfully removed property from land that does not belong to them." "Mr. Blackwood," Morrison replied with the careful courtesy he reserved for people he didn't trust, "I'm not sure what you're referring to. Perhaps you could be more specific about these alleged unlawful activities." Blackwood's gaze moved past Morrison to fix on Hatch and Martha, and his expression hardened with recognition. "Those individuals have been trespassing on property that is currently under legal dispute, and they have removed documents and artifacts that constitute evidence in a federal case involving mineral rights and national security." "National security?" Morrison's eyebrows rose. "That's quite an escalation from a simple property dispute. The springs and mineral deposits on the former Holbrook property contain strategic materials that are vital to American interests." Blackwood continued, his tone growing more authoritative. "The federal government has classified certain aspects of this case, and unauthorized persons who interfere with legitimate mining operations are subject to immediate detention and prosecution." Hatch felt the brass compass grow warm in his pocket, and he realized that Blackwood's appearance here wasn't coincidental. Somehow, the mining interest had learned about their discovery of Magnus's documents, and were moving quickly to prevent any legal challenges to their operations. "I'll need to see some documentation of these federal claims," Morrison said calmly. "Until then, these folks are my guests, and they're welcome to remain here as long as they choose." One of Blackwood's companions stepped forward, and Hatch noted the way his coat hung loose around his right shoulder, the stance of a man carrying a shoulder holster. "Sheriff, we're not asking for your cooperation. We're informing you that we have federal authority to take custody of these individuals and any materials they may have removed from the restricted area." "Funny thing about federal authority," Morrison replied, his own hand moving casually to rest on his gun belt. "It usually comes with proper paperwork and official identification. You gentlemen care to produce some credentials I can verify?" The tension in the small office was palpable as the two groups faced each other across a divide that represented more than just a legal dispute. On one side stood wealth, influence, and the kind of power that was accustomed to sweeping aside obstacles through intimidation and corruption. On the other stood the simple principle that truth and law should matter more than money and threats. Martha broke the silence by reaching into her coat and pulling out a document that Hatch hadn't seen before. "Gentlemen, before you continue making threats about federal authority, you might want to examine this." She handed the paper to Morrison, who unfolded it and read quickly before looking up at Blackwood with an expression of barely contained satisfaction. "Well, now, this is interesting. Seems we have a telegram here from the Department of Interior in Washington. Is sent yesterday afternoon in response to an inquiry about mining rights on former tribal lands in this region." Morrison read from the document in a clear voice that carried to everyone in the room. "All mining claims filed after 1873 on lands within the original Crow Nation territory are subject to review and potential nullification pending resolution of ongoing tribal water rights litigation. No mining operations are authorized to proceed until federal review is complete." Blackwood's face had gone pale, and his voice carried a note of desperation that hadn't been there moments before. "That telegram is irrelevant to our current operations. Our claims predate any tribal litigation, and we have valid permits." "Dated yesterday," Martha interrupted with a smile that held no warmth. "Amazing how quickly permits can be issued when the right people make the right phone calls. But federal law trumps county permits, doesn't it, Mr. Blackwood?" The lawyer's composure cracked completely. "You don't understand what you're interfering with. The materials in those springs are worth millions of dollars, and there are investors who have committed significant resources based on assurances that this operation would proceed without interference. Sounds like a problem for you and your investors," Morrison said. "But it's not a problem for the law, which is what I'm sworn to uphold." Blackwood's companions were growing restless, and Hatch could see the situation escalating toward violence. But before anyone could make a move that would change everything, the office door opened and Tommy Morrison entered, followed by 3 men in federal marshal badges and a woman in a business suit who carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Dad," Tommy said, "these folks are from the Justice Department in Denver. They've got some questions about mining operations in the area." The woman stepped forward and addressed Blackwood directly. "Mr. Blackwood, I am Federal Marshal Catherine Hayes. You and your associates are under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and violation of federal environmental protection laws. You have the right to remain silent." As the marshals moved to take Blackwood and his men into custody, Hayes turned to Hatch and Martha with an expression of professional courtesy. "Mr. Greeley, Mrs. Henley, we'll need your statements about what you discovered on the Holbrook property. I understand you have documents that may be relevant to our investigation." Hatch pulled the tribal papers from his coat, but kept the brass compass hidden. Some secrets he was beginning to understand were meant to be protected rather than revealed. "We have what you need," he said. "But first, there's someone up on the mountain who's been waiting 20 years to tell his own story." The final confrontation was about to begin, but now they had the law on their side and the truth finally coming to light. The question that remained was whether they could reach Magnus in time, and whether the healing springs could be saved from the destruction that greed and desperation had set in motion. The ascent to Widow's Roost with Federal Marshal Hayes and her team moved with the precision of a military operation. Hatch led the way through the mountain trails, following paths that only someone who had spent months learning the terrain could navigate in the pre-dawn darkness. Behind him rode Martha and Sheriff Morrison, followed by 3 federal marshals, whose horses picked their way carefully through the rocky terrain. The sound of machinery had grown louder as they climbed, accompanied now by shouts and what sounded like argument among the mining crew. Through breaks in the forest canopy, they could see the glow of torches and work lights illuminating the spring site where Blackwood's men continued their destructive excavation despite the arrest of their employer. "They don't know Blackwood's been taken into custody," Marshal Hayes observed, studying the scene through field glasses as they reached the ridge overlooking the operation. "Which means they're operating under orders to continue regardless of what happens in town." Hatch counted at least 8 men working around the drilling equipment, with 2 more standing guard at the perimeter of the site. But it was the absence of any sign of Magnus Holbrook that concerned him most. The tree where they'd seen him tied just hours before now stood empty, and there was no indication of where he might have been moved. The Crow people said they would protect Magnus. Martha reminded him quietly. "Mary Crowfeather strikes me as a woman who keeps her promises." As if summoned by her words, a figure emerged from the shadows near the spring site, one of the mining crew, but moving with the deliberate stealth of someone who didn't want to be seen by his companions. The man approached the tree line where they waited, and Hatch recognized him as one of the younger Crow men who had been with Mary's group. "Joseph sent me to guide you," the man said quietly, speaking to Marshal Hayes with the respectful directness of someone who understood authority. "We have Magnus safe, but the situation has become complicated. The mining foreman received new orders an hour ago, orders to complete the destruction of the springs and eliminate any witnesses before sunrise." Marshal Hayes's expression hardened. "How many of the crew are involved in the violence?" "Most are just hired workers who think they're doing legitimate mining," the Crow man replied. "But 3 of them are armed and taking orders directly from someone in Denver by telephone. They've threatened to shoot anyone who tries to leave the site." The marshal made quick decisions with the efficiency of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Morrison, take 2 of my men and circle around to cut off any escape routes down the mountain. Mrs. Henley, I need you to stay here with the horses and be ready to ride for help if this goes wrong." But Martha shook her head firmly. "Marshal, I've lived in this valley for 50 years, and I know these mountains better than your men do. If you're going to stop those people from destroying something that belongs to everyone, you need all the help you can get." Hatch pulled the brass compass from his pocket, noting that its needle was pointing steadily toward a cluster of boulders near the spring site. "Magnus is that way," he said, with certainty he couldn't explain. "The compass has been guiding us to what needs protection most, and right now that's him." Marshal Hayes studied the ancient artifact with curiosity, but didn't question Hatch's confidence in its guidance. "All right, Mr. Greeley, you and the Crow guide lead us to where they're holding Magnus. We'll coordinate our approach to secure him first, then deal with the mining operation." They moved through the forest with the careful silence of people who understood that lives depended on remaining undetected. The Crow guide led them along game trails that approached the spring site from above, where the natural granite formations provided cover and concealment. As they drew closer, the sound of drilling equipment became almost deafening, punctuated by shouted instructions and the hiss of steam from the mining machinery. But it was a different sound that made Hatch's blood run cold, the unmistakable crack of a rifle shot echoing off the mountainside, followed by angry voices and what sounded like a struggle near the equipment site. "They're shooting at something," Marshal Hayes said grimly, checking her revolver and signaling for her men to spread out in a flanking formation. Whatever Mary Crowfeather and her people are doing to protect the springs, it's provoked a violent response. Through gaps in the rocks, they could see muzzle flashes from the mining site as several of the armed men fired toward the forest. But their targets seemed to be shadows and movement rather than clearly defined enemies. The Crow warriors were using their knowledge of the terrain to harry the miners without, presenting clear targets. The brass compass in Hatch's hand was vibrating so strongly, now that he could barely hold it steady, its needle spinning wildly before settling on a direction that led toward a small cabin they could see near the edge of the mining operation. Smoke was rising from its chimney, and through its single window, the flicker of lamplight suggested someone was inside. "That's where they have Magnus," Hatch said with absolute certainty. "But we need to move fast. If those men are willing to shoot at the Crow people, they won't hesitate to kill a prisoner they no longer need." Marshal Hayes was already moving, a federal authority backed by 20 years of experience in situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between justice and tragedy. The battle for Pine Hollow's future was about to reach its climax, and everything Magnus and Eleanor had died trying to protect would be decided in the next few minutes. The rescue of Magnus Holbrook unfolded with the swift precision of a plan that had been 20 years in the making. While Marshal Hayes and her team approached the cabin from the north, Hatch and the Crow guide circled to the rear, where a small window provided a view of the interior. Through the glass, they could see Magnus bound to a wooden chair, his weathered face bearing the marks of long captivity, but his eyes still sharp and alert. 2 armed guards flanked the door, their attention focused on the gunfire and confusion outside, rather than on potential threats from within. It was exactly the opportunity they needed, and Hatch moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent years learning to survive in hostile territory. The window opened silently under pressure from his knife blade, and he slipped inside with Rufus close behind. Magnus looked up at their entrance, and the recognition in his eyes was immediate, not of Hatch personally, but of someone who carried the brass compass that had been meant to guide the worthy to this moment. "About time," Magnus whispered, his voice hoarse but steady. "I was beginning to think that compass of mine had lost its way." Hatch cut the ropes that bound Magnus while Rufus positioned himself near the door, ears alert for any sign that the guards had detected their presence. Outside, the sound of gunfire continued, but it was becoming more sporadic, a sign that the Crow warriors were winning their battle to protect the spring site. "Can you walk?" Hatch asked as he helped Magnus to his feet. "Been walking for 20 years, Magnus replied with a grim smile. "Just not where I wanted to go." They moved toward the window, but before they could make their escape, one of the guards pushed through the cabin door with his rifle raised. The man's eyes widened as he took in the scene, the cut ropes, the open window, and Magnus standing free for the first time in 2 decades. "Nobody moves," the guard shouted, swinging his weapon to cover all 3 men. "Boss said to shoot anyone who tried to interfere, and that includes the old man if he causes trouble." But the guard had made the mistake of ignoring Rufus, who launched himself at the man's gun arm with the protective fury of a dog defending his pack. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as man and dog crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs and snarling. Hatch and Magnus didn't wait to see the outcome of the struggle. They dove through the window as the second guard burst into the cabin and rolled down the rocky slope that led toward the spring site where Marshal Hayes was directing the final phase of the operation. The scene that greeted them was one of controlled chaos. The federal marshals had successfully surrounded the mining site, and most of Blackwood's hired workers had thrown down their tools and surrendered when they realized they were facing federal law enforcement rather than local opposition. The drilling equipment stood silent, its steam engines cooling in the mountain air, but 3 men continued to resist from a position near the main spring, using the mining equipment as cover while they fired at anyone who tried to approach. These were the true believers in Blackwood's cause, men who had been paid well to ensure that the springs were destroyed regardless of the cost. "They've rigged explosives," Marshal Hayes called out as Hatch and Magnus reached her position behind a granite outcropping. "If we can't take them alive, they're threatening to detonate charges that will collapse the entire spring system." Magnus studied the situation with the tactical eye of someone who had spent 20 years planning for this moment. "They don't understand what they're threatening to destroy," he said quietly. The springs aren't just local phenomena. They're part of a water system that extends throughout the mountain range. If they collapse the main chambers, they'll affect water supplies for 100 miles in every direction. Mary Crow Feather emerged from the forest with 3 of her warriors, their faces painted for battle and their eyes holding the fierce determination of people defending sacred ground. "The spirits of the water are angry," she said simply. "They will not allow this desecration to continue." As if summoned by her words, the mountain itself seemed to respond. A deep, rumbling sound emerged from beneath their feet, and the spring water that had been flowing clear and steady began to bubble and churn with increasing violence. The brass compass in Hatch's pocket grew so hot that he had to remove it, and its needle spun wildly before pointing directly at the main spring outlet. "The explosives," Magnus said with sudden understanding. "They've destabilized something down there. The charges aren't just threatening to collapse the chambers, they're going to trigger a blowout that will destroy everything." The 3 holdout gunmen seemed to realize that their position was becoming untenable as the ground beneath their feet began to shake. But instead of surrendering, their leader, a hard-faced man with the look of someone who had killed before, raised his rifle toward the detonator. He'd placed near the spring outlet. "If we can't have it," he shouted over the growing rumble from underground. "Nobody can." The final moment of the 20-year battle for Pine Hollow's future had arrived, and everything would be decided by who could reach that detonator first. The race to reach the detonator became a moment suspended outside time, where 20 years of secrets and suffering would be resolved in the space of a heartbeat. Marshal Hayes and her team moved with professional precision, but they were too far away to prevent the gunmen from triggering the explosives that would destroy Pine Hollow's water system forever. But the mountain spirits that Mary Crow Feather had invoked seemed to have their own plans for justice. As the gunman's finger tightened on the detonator switch, the ground beneath the mining site gave way with a tremendous crack that sent him tumbling into a crevice that had opened in the bedrock. The detonator flew from his grasp, skittering across the rocky ground toward the edge of the main spring outlet. Hatch moved without conscious thought, driven by the same instinct that had carried him through years of grief and isolation. He dove across the unstable ground as more cracks appeared in the rock face, his fingers closing around the explosive device just as it teetered on the brink of falling into the churning spring water below. For a moment that stretched like eternity, he hung suspended over the opening that led to the underground chambers where Magnus and Eleanor had discovered their miraculous gift. The brass compass in his pocket pulsed with warmth against his ribs, and he could feel the power of the healing waters calling to him, not with words, but with a sense of welcome that reminded him of coming home after a long and difficult journey. Then strong hands gripped his arms and pulled him back to safety. Magnus and Joseph standing. Bear hauled him away from the crumbling edge while Marshal Hayes secured the detonator and began the careful process of disarming the explosive charges that could have destroyed everything. The remaining gunmen surrendered without further resistance as federal agents moved in to take them into custody. The mining equipment stood silent and abandoned, its steam engines cooling in the mountain air while the natural sounds of wind and water gradually returned to the sacred space. As the immediate danger passed, the true scope of what they had saved became clear. The underground chambers that Magnus had mapped so carefully remained intact, their crystal formations continuing to filter and purify the water that emerged from deep within the mountain. The healing springs flowed as they had for countless generations, carrying their gift of renewal to anyone who approached them with genuine need and proper respect. 3 months later, Hatch stood on the front porch of Widow's Roost, watching the first snows of winter dust the peaks that surrounded Pine Hollow. The mansion had been restored to much of its former grandeur, though he had chosen to live simply in the rooms that overlooked the garden where Eleanor had once grown her healing herbs. Magnus occupied the master suite, his health gradually returning as he readjusted to freedom and the company of people who valued his knowledge rather than seeking to exploit it. The legal resolution had been swift. Once the federal authorities became involved, the tribal water rights documents that Joseph Standing Bear had prepared 20 years earlier were finally filed and recognized, establishing the Crow Nation as guardians of the spring system that extended throughout the mountain region. Magnus had signed the transfer papers with the satisfaction of a man completing work that had been interrupted far too long. Cyrus Blackwood and his associates faced federal charges for kidnapping, environmental destruction, and conspiracy. The mining claims that had threatened Pine Hollow were declared invalid, and the equipment that had been used to damage the springs was removed and the site restored under tribal supervision. But the most meaningful change was harder to quantify in legal documents or newspaper articles. The healing springs, now protected by both federal law and tribal authority, had been open to anyone who approached them with genuine need. People came from throughout the region seeking relief from ailments that conventional medicine couldn't touch, and many found the renewal they sought in the crystal-clear waters that emerged from the mountain's heart. Martha Henley had been appointed as the official liaison between the town of Pine Hollow and the tribal guardians, a role that suited her natural inclination to take care of people and ensure that no one was forgotten or left behind. She visited Widow's Roost daily, sometimes bringing meals, sometimes just checking to make sure that two old men living alone in a big house were taking proper care of themselves. "No," she said one evening as they sat in the mansion's restored parlor watching snow fall past the tall windows. Eleanor would be pleased to see her house filled with conversation and purpose again. She always said that big houses were meant to shelter big hearts, not just big bank accounts. Magnus nodded, his eyes distant with memories both painful and precious. She understood that the real treasure was never the silver in the ground or even the healing properties of the water. It was the possibility of using whatever gifts we'd been given to make life better for other people. Hatch pulled the brass compass from his pocket, noting that its needle now pointed steadily toward magnetic north, its work of guidance finally complete. "What do you think she would say about all this?" Magnus smiled, and for a moment his weathered face showed traces of the younger man who had built this mansion as a monument to love and hope. "I think she would say that sometimes the longest journeys bring us exactly where we were meant to be all along." Outside, the snow continued to fall over Pine Hollow, blanketing the valley in the peaceful silence of winter. The healing springs flowed beneath the frozen ground, carrying their gift of renewal through the darkness toward another spring, another season of growth and possibility. And in the stone mansion that nobody had wanted, 3 people who had lost everything they thought mattered most had found something even more valuable: the understanding that home isn't a place you find, but a peace you make with yourself and share with those who need it most.